Hey everyone, and welcome to the second module of Blender Procedural Material Mastery. Today we are going to be making this procedural marble material, and before we get stuck into it, I'm just going to show you what we will be making. So you can see that we've got this nice node group here, which allows us to easily adjust all of our different important parameters. You can see at the top here, I've got these ones here, which allows us to adjust our color. The color 2 will just be for these kind of cracks here, and the color 1 will be the kind of underneath part. Scale here will allow us to adjust the size of the entire material, and then you can see I've got different levels of scale. So I've got a background pattern scale, which is for some noise, which is underneath, and as I adjust that, that can help me get some more variety. There's also a parameter here to adjust the brightness of our cracks. This can be great for creating some more contrast. We can also adjust the saturation of the cracks as well, and we can adjust the scale of the cracks individually too. Then we've got roughness strength, which will just allow us to further adjust the clarity of our reflections. Notice how if I increase this, our material will get less reflective, so if that's what you're going for, that can be a great way to adjust it. Scale roughness will allow us to adjust the size of the roughness imperfections underneath. When we cover this, I'll give you a more visual example of what this does. Then we have UV or object, which allows us to switch between either using the UV map as a reference for how our material is placed, or the object coordinates, which will just display it across the object evenly. We tend to only really use the UV coordinates for the brick texture, since the procedural brick texture in Blender is a 2D texture, which will struggle with object coordinates. Of course, no matter which option you use, you can always bake these into textures later if you need them as textures. And if you're interested in texture baking, I do have a beginner and mastery course on texture baking, so make sure to check that out after this course if you're interested in that topic. Now I'm going to left click this button here to have a look inside, and you can see we have quite a few nodes here, but it's nothing too complex. If you're intimidated by all these noodles, don't worry, I'll be going through this step by step and you'll find it's not as complex as it looks. Here you can see I've organized everything, so I've got my base color input here, and this is another part which is combined into the base color. Then down here I've got all the nodes I need to create the roughness imperfections. Here I've got this little node set up here, which allows us to easily switch between UV coordinates and object coordinates using that UV or object switch, which if you remember is this parameter here. You also see we have some multiply math nodes, and these are just going to allow us to adjust our scale and things like that from outside of this node setup. Awesome, so now I've explained that, let's go ahead and get started. So I've just set up a new blend file here, and you can see on the right hand corner here that I have a key map here, so whenever I click my mouse or press a key on my computer, you can see what key I've pressed or what button I've clicked. To get started, I'm going to add a simple object, so I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm just going to add a cube, then I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode, and I'll press A to select everything, and then I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to choose Subdivide. Then you'll see this little menu in the bottom left hand corner will appear, and I'm just going to change the number of cuts to something a bit more high resolution, like maybe 16. Then I'm going to left click Mesh, still with everything selected, then under Transform, I'm going to press to Sphere, and type in the number 1. That's going to create a nice quad sphere, which looks pretty nice. Then I'll press Tab to come back into object mode, and I'll right click and shade smooth. Now we've just got a basic object to start with. You can of course use another object if you'd like, but I like to use a sphere for simplicity's sake. Then I'm going to left click my clock here and change to the shader editor, and I'll just left click and drag to pull this up, and it seems to set mine to line style by default for some reason. This has only happened since I switched to Blender 4.2, but it should be set to object, so just make sure you've got that selected, and then we can go ahead and press plus new to add a new material. I'll then left click this material text here and just type in marble. But the problem is, if right now, if I left click my color here and change it, you can see no change in here, and that's because we need to go into material preview. So I'm just going to left click it up here, it's this third button along. But right now our material is completely black, even though we've changed the base color, and this is something that seems to happen in Blender 4.2. But to fix it, all we need to do is adjust a few settings. So I'm going to change my render engine from cycles here to Eevee, and then I'm going to scroll down to ray tracing and left click this box to enable it. Then I'll change my max roughness to 1, and now you can see our material is working properly. If this still hasn't worked for you, it may be that your computer isn't compatible with Blender 4.2, or the Eevee in Blender 4.2 at least. In which case, I'd recommend using a previous version, such as Blender 4.1, which still works really well. If you're using Blender 4.1 or earlier, you won't need to worry about this step, as these settings don't exist yet. For now, I'm going to change my render engine from Eevee back to cycles, but since we're not doing any rendering in this course, it doesn't really matter. As I mentioned in the last module of this course, to get started we're going to work from the top down, so that means we'll be starting with base color. You might be thinking blue is an inappropriate color, And while it is, it doesn't really matter because we're going to be using another node to input the color. So to start off, let's add that node which is called the mix color node. So I'll press Shift A, then under color, I'm just going to choose mix color. You can also search it in the add menu in order to find any of these nodes if you're struggling. I'm then going to plug my result into the base color. You can see it's now going to use a mixture between color A and B, which just happens to be this kind of very light gray or white. And we're going to make these two colors our marble color. So I'm just going to make my first color here a more kind of black color. If you want to get the exact same color as me, you can come to the hex here and type in this number here. And for my color B here, I'm going to create a more dark gray. If you want to get the exact same color as me, again, we can just use this hex number and type this exact number in, and you'll get the same as me. And right now, if I change this factor, you can see it will switch between the black color and the gray color. But this doesn't look very interesting. So we're going to want to use something as a mask in order to create some variation between these two colors. The reason why we use this mixed color instead of a color ramp like you see in a lot of tutorials is because the color ramp cannot be edited in that node group setup easily. So using a mixed color instead is a great way to allow us to adjust the colors using a node group later. So for this mask, we're just going to use a very simple noise texture. So I'll press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose noise texture, and I'm going to plug my factor into the factor of this mix node. If you zoom in, straight away you can see we have a little bit more variation between the two colors. It'll become more apparent if I left click my B1 here and make this brighter. You can really see this variation. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that because I quite like the subtle color difference. We also need to choose the correct input texture coordinates. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under input, I'm going to choose texture coordinate, which if you remember from our texture basics course, allows us to choose how our texture will be placed on the object using one of these input coordinates here. So since noise texture is a 3D texture, the object coordinates are going to be great because they're just going to place the texture across the object evenly. However, if you want to have a little bit more control over this, you can use a color ramp in order to change the contrast. So to do that, I would just press Shift A, and then under converter, I'll choose color ramp, and I'll just plug that in between these two nodes. Now I can left click one of these notches and drag, and you can see as I move it, we can get some higher contrast results. To be honest though, I ended up keeping this at the default back here for my marble, as I didn't really like the more contrasted look, but I've added this node in here just in case you wanted to adjust it yourself. Something I did in my marble as well is I actually increased this detail. Increasing detail is just like layering some scaled noise textures on top of each other, which creates a little bit more of a unique effect. So I'm going to change my detail here to the number 3, and that just adds a little bit of subtle detail. As I mentioned in the first installment of this course, we're going to be organizing as we go. So now I've created this setup, I'm just going to move my texture coordinate away since we don't need it just now, and I'm just going to left click and box select these nodes here and press Ctrl J. You'll see this creates a nice border around our nodes, which allows us to left click and drag to move them easily. This is great for keeping everything organized and less messy. I'm then going to open my side menu, which I can open by just pressing N to open close it. And if I come up to my node options here, you can see I can edit my selected node, which is this panel here, and just give it a name in the label. Since this is going to be at the very bottom of our base color, I'm just going to call it background color. Although in my setup, I just called it main color. You can call it whatever you think is most easy to understand for you. Now we can go ahead and start making the cracks for our color. So to create our crack effect, we're just going to use one of our built-in procedural textures called the Voronoi texture. So to add that, all I need to do is press Shift A. You can either use the search bar, or you can come to texture and left click Voronoi texture. We're going to be using the object coordinates for this one as well. So I'm just going to plug my object into the vector. In order to preview what this looks like, I'm just going to plug my distance into the surface. You can see this is what our texture looks like. But right now, this doesn't really look like cracks. And to fix that, we're going to use one of the options inside the Voronoi texture to change it to a more crack effect. So all I need to do is left click this F1 option and change it to distance to edge. Distance to edge is an option I use a lot to create these kind of crack effects. We'll also be using it to create some leather in the next tutorial. You may be overwhelmed by all these different options, but to be honest, you probably won't use half of the options that Blender offers. So don't feel too stressed about needing to know what every single operation does, as you may not even need them. I'm maybe going to change the scale of my cracks to something a bit bigger, like 7. You can see that by increasing this number, it's made the size of our cracks in here smaller in proportion to the size of our object. So do keep that in mind when you're scaling something. Making it bigger will make the texture bigger, but that can maybe make the size of the thing compared to your object seem smaller. One thing with our cracks though is you can see they are creating quite a gradient here, and to be honest, I want to have it a little bit more higher contrast than that. I'm going to show you how to adjust the contrast a little bit later, because first I want to show you what problem I'm trying to fix by adjusting the contrast. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under color, I'm going to choose Mix Color. And this is going to be the node which will eventually plug into the base color when our setup is finished. this Voronoi texture is going to be acting as our mask, just like how this noise texture is the mask for our two color options here. So as you might guess, this distance is going to plug into the factor, which will allow it to act as a mask for this mix node. If I then plug my mix node result into the surface, you will notice we have a plain light grey material, and this is because colors A and B are exactly the same, and they're this light grey colour, which just creates a plain light grey result, since there's nothing to differentiate between. If you remember, on the Voronoi texture, the cracks were this more darker grey or almost black colour. If you remember from the mix nodes and masks section of the Texture Basics beginner course, colours that are darker or closer to black will be closer to the number 0, and colours which are brighter and closer to white will be closer to the number 1. And if you remember, the factor is a number between 0 and 1. So what this mask will be doing is it will be telling this mix node to input one colour to the colours closer to black or 0 and another colour to the colours closer to white or 1. Thankfully, it's pretty straightforward. A will be the 0 and B will be the 1. This makes sense because if I set my A socket to a colour like red, you can see all the cracks have gone red, and that's because our Voronoi texture has black cracks. And since A represents 0 or closer to black colours, that means the A socket is going to control how the cracks are going to look. I'll left click and drag my result, plug it back into the surface again, and hopefully that gives you a little bit more clarity on how these masks work. But if you're struggling, I recommend recapping on the masks and mix nodes video, which I'll link in the resources section of this module. But having red and white seems a little bit out of place here, and what we're actually going to be using is we're going to be using our background colour and inputting it into here. This makes sense because if you remember, I said that we're going to be plugging this mix node into the base color at the end of this node cell. So since this is the only thing going into the base color, it makes sense that we have to mix in our background color into our cracks at some point. So to start off, let's left click and drag our result and plug it into the A socket, and then we'll left click and drag it again into the B socket. Now our result will just be this background color since A and B are exactly the same. But what we're going to do is we want to make our cracks a little bit brighter. So we can do that very easily using a node called the Hue Saturation Value node. So I'll press Shift A, and then under Color, I'm going to choose Hue Saturation Value. This is a node which will allow us to adjust color input and create a new output as a result. So I'm going to plug this in between the cracks one, which is going to be socket A if you remember. So I'll plug it in there, and at its default settings, it will make no change. But all we need to do is increase our parameters here. So I'm going to choose the value one, and if I increase this number, it's going to make the cracks brighter, or more specifically, it's going to create a brighter version of this background color. So I'm going to change it to something like 1.4. And you can see, while things look brighter here, there's not enough contrast here to really see the cracks. And that's why I mentioned that we might want to adjust the contrast of these cracks for the mask. So this is why I wanted to do that. So to do that, we can just use a color ramp, as some of you might have guessed. To add one, I'll just press Shift A, and then under Converter, I'm going to choose Color Ramp. And then I'm just going to plug that in between the Voronoi texture and the mix node. And I can simply left click this white notch here, and I'm just going to pull it closer to the black one to increase the contrast. You can see now I've increased the contrast that we've got some nice cracks here. I'm going to change the position here to 0.175, and you can do that if you want to get the exact same contrast as me. Then if you remember, we need to organize our nodes a bit more. So I'm just going to first of all select these two nodes by left click and box selecting them, and then press Ctrl J, and I'm just going to call this node panel here by left clicking it and then coming to our side panel, which if you remember, we just press N to open and close it. I'm just going to call the label by coming to the node options, cracks color mask. Then I'm going to move these nodes around a little bit more. Then I'll left click and box select these ones here, and I'm just going to press Ctrl J, and this group of nodes here, I'm going to left click the panel, and then I'll call it in the label cracks color. I'll zoom out, and I'm just going to move things around a little bit. So I'll left click and drag this panel here, and then I'll left click and drag this panel here. You can also press G with your panel selected to move it, whatever you prefer. Once I'm happy with my organization here, I'm just going to scroll in, and I'm going to left click this mix node here, as this is going to be our base color input, and I like to create a label for this just to make it really easy to identify in case we unhook it. So I'm going to press Ctrl J, then I'm going to left click the panel, and I'm just going to call it base color input. And I also like to give it a color to also make it very easy to identify. So you can see there's this option called color, which you can just check the box to enable, and if you left click the arrow beside it, you can pick a color here. I go for an orange color since yellow is a little bit hard to see, but orange is pretty close to the yellow socket that base color has. But this is really up to you. I'm going to plug my result into the base color of my shader, and then I'm going to plug my BSDF or shader output into the surface. Awesome, now we have our base color complete, we can go ahead and move on to the roughness. I'm just going to left click and drag to move these up, and if you remember, roughness just controls the clarity of our reflections. So for our roughness, I'm just going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose noise texture. I'll then plug my factor, or fac, into the surface so we can see what it looks like. Then I'll plug my object coordinates into the vector. And there, this is what our noise texture looks like. We are going to want to turn off this normalize option, which will create a result like this. If you're using a version of Blender before Blender 4.1, you can use a Musgrave texture instead, as noise texture doesn't have this normalize option yet. This is because in Blender 4.1, the Musgrave texture was removed and then combined into the noise texture. Then I'm going to want to change the color of this, because right now, if I was to plug this into roughness, this would make it super reflective in all these black areas and kind of medium reflectiveness in all these kind of white or greyish areas. If you remember, that's because black is closer to 0 and roughness closer to 0 is more reflective. So how can we adjust these colors? To do that, I just used a color ramp. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under converter, I'm going to choose color ramp, and I'm going to plug this in between. I'm going to leave my first color at black, and I'm going to maybe change my white color to something a little bit darker. If you want to get the exact same color as me, you can type in this hex number here. Adjust the contrast as well if you would like to, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. Then I'm just going to go ahead and plug my color into the roughness, and then I'll plug my BSDF into the surface. And awesome, there, now we have our marble material complete. All we need to do now is turn this into a node group. But congratulations for finishing the shader itself. I'll quickly organize these nodes, so I'm just going to left click and drag, and then I'll press Ctrl J. I'm going to left click the panel and then come to the node options here, and under label, I'm just going to call it roughness. If you've forgotten how to open and close this menu, just remember it's N on the keyboard. If you want a way to remember it, you could think of it as N for near the side, since it's near the side of this menu. Now to get started with our node group, I'm just going to need to left click and drag and select all of my nodes apart from this material output node here. So make sure you have everything selected, and then you can go ahead and press Ctrl G. Now you'll see our material output will disappear and we'll have these two new nodes instead. These two nodes allow us to control what comes out of the node and what we can put into the node with the group input and output. If I left click this arrow, I can come up to the top again, and you'll see we've now reduced our shader into this tiny node. I'm going to left click this node group here, and then I'm just going to call it marble. Then you can left click this button here to go back inside your node group. The first parameter that I want to control from the outside is the color. So I'm just going to plug the A and the B socket into the group input. Now you'll notice when I press this arrow to go up that we can now adjust the colors from the outside. If you want to give these a more descriptive name than color A and B, you certainly can. All you need to do is come to your side menu, which you can press N to open or close. And then if we go inside of our node, we can left click this option called group. This allows us to change the names of our sockets. If it's an output option, you'll see that the dot will be on the right hand side, whereas if it's an input option, it's going to have a dot on the left hand side. I'm going to left click the A option, double click it, and just call it color A. For the B option, I'll double click it and call it color B. And you'll notice if I left click this arrow to come up that we now have the correct names that we adjusted it to. I'll left click this button to come back into our node setup, and now let's move on to creating our scale parameter. So for the scale parameter, it's going to allow us to adjust the scale of all three of these textures. So to do that, we are going to need some math nodes, and the reason for that is because I want to be able to adjust them individually as well. So using a math node will allow us to have two ways of controlling each one. So I'm going to press Shift A, and in the search bar, I'll just search for math. Then I'll just drag it over here to where my background color setup is. So we don't want to have an add, we're actually going to want to change it to multiply. Then I'm going to change my first parameter here to 1, and then I'm just going to make the second value our scale that we have just now, which is 5. And as you know, 1 times 5 is 5. So when I plug this value into the scale for our noise texture will be exactly the same, but now we have two ways of controlling it. I'm going to plug my value of 1 into a socket here, which will be called value. I'll then come to my group options here in the side panel and double click value, and then I'm just going to call it scale. You can also add a description here, like for example, scales the entire material. And now when I left click this arrow to come up, and if I hover my mouse over the scale parameter, you can see it says scales entire material. So if you ever forget what something does, naming it can help. If I left click and drag this, you can see right now it's only going to adjust the color underneath. And so since this is a scale of 5, that means that the scale of our noise texture will now be 25. I'm going to change my scale back down to 1. So how can we get it so it scales all these textures at once? Well, it's very simple. I'll just left click my multiply node and press Shift D to duplicate, and I'm going to bring it down to our cracks color mask. Here you can see the scale is 7, so I'm going to change my second value here to 7. And then I'll plug my value into the scale, since 1 times 7 is 7, our scale will still be 7. Then I'm going to plug the value of 1 into the scale socket. Now if I left click this arrow to go up, when I adjust the scale parameter, it's going to scale both the cracks and the background color at the same time. I'll left click this scale and set it back to 1, which is the default. Then I'm going to left click this node group option, and we're going to do the same thing for our roughness imperfection texture as well. So I'll left click the multiply, press Shift D to duplicate, and I'm going to change the value of the second option to 5. Then I'll plug this value into the scale, and then I'll plug my 1 into the scale everything input. Awesome. And now what we can do, if we want to edit the scale of all these individual textures from the outside, we can then plug the other value into their own separate sockets. So I'll plug this value of 5 into this value here, and since this multiply node is for this noise texture here, I'm just going to come to my input options here in the side menu and double click value, and I'm going to call it background color scale. Now when I left click this arrow to come up, if I left click and drag this node to make it a bit bigger, you can see I've now got a parameter to control just the background color scale on its own. I'll left click this button to come back into my node setup, and I'm just going to repeat this process for the rest of the multiply nodes. So I'll plug in my Voronoi or cracks texture scale of 7 into its own unique socket by just going into the empty one, and I'll call this one cracks scale and press enter. And then we'll repeat by left click and dragging this value of 5 into its own socket, and we'll just call this value roughness imperfection scale. Awesome. Now when I come up, you can see we've got plenty of ways to scale and adjust our material. Something I'm also going to add is I'm going to left click my multiply node and press Shift D, and then I'm going to change it from a multiply node to an add node. I'm then going to plug my roughness color into the first socket, and the second socket I'm just going to set it to 0, which means it's going to be adding nothing. What this will do is it will allow us to increase or decrease the strength of our roughness, meaning we can make our material less rough or more rough on demand. This is because if I increase the number of this value, it's going to be adding onto our color. So for example, this black channel here is currently set to 0, and if we were to add 0.1 to that, it's going to be slightly more grey, meaning it's going to be slightly more rough or less reflective. I'll then plug my value into the roughness, and right now, since we're adding 0 to our texture, there's going to be no noticeable difference, as it is still exactly the same. I'm then going to plug my value though, all the way into a fresh input socket here, and I'm going to call this value roughness strength. However, I don't want this roughness strength parameter to be taken too high or too low, so I'm going to set a minimum and a maximum. So here in the min and max options, I'm just going to set the minimum to -1, and the maximum to 1. This will stop it from going too high or too low. Now when I come up, I can change this roughness strength by maybe increasing it to make it more rough or less reflective, or I can decrease it to make it more reflective. Of course, this will be only noticeable after a certain point, as roughness is kind of limited between 0 and 1. I'll left click this node group to go back into it, and the last thing I'm going to do is give us a way to switch between object coordinates and UV coordinates, just in case you want to use a UV unwrap you've made for your marble material. Although I pretty much always use object for this marble material. So to do this, it's very simple. We can just use a mix color node. So I'll press Shift A, then under color, I'm going to choose mix color. And then I'm just going to plug object into the A socket, which means object represents a factor of 0, and UV into the B socket, which means UV represents a factor of 1. And I'm just going to set it at 0 just now. Then we're going to go ahead and plug this result into the vector sockets. If you're wondering why this is working, that is because the purple and yellow sockets are actually compatible with each other. And technically, the yellow socket is also a vector. If you're confused about vectors, I recommend refreshing on the Vectors Explained video inside the Texture Basics course. I'll leave a link to that video in the lesson resources as well. And I'm going to plug my result into the vector of the other two textures, and I'll plug it into this roughness one as well. And awesome, now it should be working just fine. Now you'll notice if I set my factor to 1, it's now going to use the UV coordinates instead. For now though, I'm going to change my factor back down to 0 to use the object coordinates. But how can we get this to create a switch for our group node? Well, to do that, all we need to do is plug our factor into an empty socket. And right now, this would be fine because we could just come up and we could adjust it to 1 manually. But I like to make it more like a switch. So I'll left click my factor socket, and I'm going to change the type from float to integer. This will mean when we increase this number, it's going to snap between whole numbers, meaning we can go straight from 0 to 1, since we don't really want to create a gradient in between using a decimal place. The only problem though is that we can increase our number far beyond the number 1 or far lower than 0, and we only need 0 and 1 since the factor only works between 0 and 1. So for that reason, we'll set a minimum and maximum of 0 and then a maximum of 1. So I'll change my minimum to 0 and then my maximum to 1, and now it'll be locked between those two numbers. If you forget which one is which, you can always type in the description here, object equals 0, and then you can maybe put in a comma and then type UV equals 1. Now we are finished. We can just left click this arrow to come up, and you'll also notice for your hint here, if you highlight over here, you can see it says object equals 0 and UV equals 1. It looks like I forgot to change the name here, so I'm just going to left click this to go back in, and then where it says factor, I'll just double click and then just type in UV or object. And now when I go up, you can see we have a complete node setup. Awesome. Well done on completing this first procedural material in our Procedural Material Mastery course. Next time, we're going to be creating some leather, and we're just going to be continuing to get a little bit more advanced from there. Feel free to share your results in the community, as I'd love to see how you're getting on with this course. Apart from that though, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this module of this course, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.